Chapter 7, the Early Republic. The Republican takeover of the American national government in 1801, Thomas Jefferson's revolution, if you will, coincided with increased opportunities for education, for literacy, and for freedom in everyday American life. In other ways, however, a new national culture would soon begin to take shape that would pose a serious challenge to these Republican ideals. In education, Thomas Jefferson and his Republican cohorts advocated for an enlightened society, and they sought to make education compulsory for boys in the new United States. As Americans placed more and more value on the idea of Republican motherhood, that is the idea that women would be incubators of these Republican virtues and would teach it to their sons, Judith Sargent Murray and others would write and argue for equal educational opportunities for girls, the future teachers and the mothers of America's leaders. Republicans also invested in efforts to uplift Native Americans by placing them in English or white schools, though no such effort was made to educate enslaved African Americans anywhere on the American continent. The medical community made a newfound commitment in the 19th century to the scientific method, despite their age-old prejudices and superstitions. Still, patients often had more to fear from their doctors than from their illnesses. Former President George Washington, for instance, died of a minor throat infection in 1799 when his doctor's efforts to try to bleed and purge him went too far. Over time, the professionalization of the medical field by men would push women out of the field, including midwives. On the subject of slavery at the dawn of the 19th century, Gabriel's Rebellion, that was a thwarted effort by over 1,000 individuals, some of them enslaved blacks, to carry out an attack on Richmond, Virginia, to turn the state into an anti-slave state. Despite the failure here, white Southerners learned a couple of lessons. First, it suggested, this event, Gabriel's Rebellion, that enslaved black Virginians were capable of and very ready to carry out a sophisticated and violent revolution if given the opportunity, undermining their white supremacist assumptions about the inherent intellectual inferiority of blacks. Furthermore, Gabriel's Rebellion demonstrated the white efforts to suppress news of other slave revolts happening in different places around the world were failing, especially the 1791 slave rebellion in Haiti, where blacks staged an American-style revolution and took control of the country. Slaves, too, could stage their own movement for independence. Not only did some literate enslaved people read accounts of the successful attack in Virginia's newspapers, but others also heard about the rebellion firsthand when slaveholding refugees from Haiti arrived in Virginia with their enslaved laborers after 1793. Even as slavery strengthened its grip on the southern colonies in the Jeffersonian era, the seeds of slavery's destruction were also sown. Among religious circles, Christian traditionalists in this era were alarmed by a new rational religious doctrine taking hold, theologies that reflected modern scientific attitudes. Deism, the concept of deism, which had originated from French philosophers, advocated for an understanding of a watchmaker God. That is, God created the universe, but it ticks along without his influence. Beginning in 1801, traditional religiosity staged a dramatic comeback in a wave of revivalism known as the Second Great Awakening. These two competing visions of the world would play out in the 19th century. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians found success 60 years after the First Great Awakening, presiding over camp meetings, and convincing folks to embrace piety, to reject skeptical rationalism, deism, and readmit God and Christ into their daily lives. Again, women comprised the majority of participants in this Great Awakening. The movement of industrial work out of the home and into factories robbed women of economic opportunities they previously had, and religious enthusiasm provided women access to a new range of activities outside the home, charitable societies for orphans, missionary organizations, etc. Black revivalism among slaves created racial unrest in the South, and the religious conversion of Handsome Lake, a Seneca Indian, posed a movement against destructive white customs and a revival of traditional Indian ways. It's only not white society that goes through religious revivals. The relative unimportance of the United States federal government during Jefferson's era was symbolized by the character of the new capital, which remained little more than a swampy village of the District of Columbia. Congressmen had no permanent homes in D.C., the District of Columbia, Just a swamp still. And Jefferson himself did not always bother to dress up to meet visitors at the presidential mansion, and that would be the future White House. Jefferson, however, was a shrewd and practical politician who used his powers of appointment as an effective political weapon. He had little difficulty in winning re-election against his Federalist opponent in 1804. Remember, Jefferson is the ambassador of the anti-Federalist vision of a small agrarian republic, and so it's the Republicans and the Federalists at this time. Both Jefferson administrations moved deliberately to reverse the lavish spending of the Federalists, Washington and Adams. Jefferson persuaded Congress to abolish all taxes. Remember, he's the small government guy, leaving customs duties and the sale of Western lands as the sole sources of federal income. He reduced the United States Army to 2,500 soldiers and the Navy to just 7 ships. Anything but the smallest of standing armies, he argued, might threaten the civil liberties of the American people. The arcs of United States President Thomas Jefferson and the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, both important advocates of democratic self-government, coincide in the early 19th century. France retained its title to Louisiana, which Napoleon hoped would soon become the heart of a French empire on the American continent. Jefferson craftily persuaded Napoleon to sell him the Louisiana Territory in the Louisiana Purchase. He also commissioned Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery to cross the expanded continent after the Louisiana Purchase, to travel all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and he commissioned Zebulon Pike to explore the Mississippi Valley and Colorado. Some Federalists, specifically a group called the Essex Junto, worried that the addition of new states would inevitably weaken the old states of the Union, and they opposed Jefferson's new exploration of the West by threatening secession, or an attempt to leave the United States. Aaron Burr, infamous name, and Alexander Hamilton, oppositional candidates for the governorship of New York, dueled each other in part over the question of secession. Burr, who had been accused of treason, now risked murder charges after he shot and killed Hamilton. He fled to the West and affiliated himself with a movement to take Mexico from Spain. It was captured but acquitted by the Chief Justice John Marshall. The Burr conspiracy, as it came to be known, is a symbol of the larger peril still facing this young country. A 2-weak central government and an abundance of political leaders willing, if necessary, to circumvent normal channels in their quest for power and influence. Burr's story does not end with him shooting Hamilton. Unyielding westward expansion by whites created constant collisions with Native Americans committed to protecting their lands from intruders. Threatened tribes mobilized to resist white encroachments, and as the Napoleonic Wars between the British and the French escalated across Europe, the Indian conflict in America became intertwined with the European conflict, which soon together snowballed into the War of 1812. In the first years of the 19th century, American commercial ships at sea increasingly found themselves caught between Napoleon's decrees and Great Britain's commercial blockade. Most Americans considered the British the worst offender, since British vessels took to stopping American ships and taking sailors off those ships' decks, making them victims of impressment. Put it as a technology here, impressment. It was at least originally a legitimate effort to retake British seamen who'd left their floating hell and defected to America's merchant marine navy. But a severe manpower shortage pushed the British Navy to abuse this practice. The British were stopping and taking men who were not British Americans and pushing them and forcing them into service at sea on behalf of Great Britain. Jefferson and James Madison tried to maintain peace with Europe, the French and the British, by implementing an embargo, which prohibited Americans from leaving the United States by ship for any foreign port. Just stop traveling and they'll stop abducting sailors and we won't have war. Widely evaded, the law was effective enough to create a serious economic depression in the young United States. Days before his term ended, Jefferson approved a bill ending his unpopular experiment with peaceable coercion, is what this is sometimes called. James Madison, another Republican, was elected in 1804 with a slim majority and attempted a more moderate embargo that allowed trade and transportation with all nations but Britain and France, the principal aggressors of war. American natives, Native Americans, with renewed desperation, continued to look to England for protection against American land incursions and harsh removal policies. Prior to the United States Revolution, many Native Americans had successfully balanced a delicate diplomacy between empires which scholars have called the play-off system, meaning I'm going to play off one or the other. After the Revolution, the American Revolution, Native American diplomats developed relationships with the United States, maintained or ceased relations with the British Empire or with Spain in the South, and negotiated their relationship with other native nations. Formal diplomatic negotiations included native rituals to reestablish relationships and open communication. Treaty conferences took place in native towns, at neutral sites and borderlands, and in state and federal capitals. While native chiefs were politically important, skilled orators like Red Jacket, as well as other intermediaries and interpreters, also played key roles in negotiations between whites and natives, or natives and natives. Native American orators were known for their metaphorical language, their command of an audience, and their compelling voice and gestures. Now, after the Revolution, facing the rush of whites westward in this new 19th century, natives were left fewer diplomatic options than ever before. Jefferson's solution to this Indian problem was to offer Indian peoples a choice: convert themselves into settled farmers and join white society, or migrate permanently west of the Mississippi. Jefferson and other American leaders considered assimilation a benign alternative to the continuing conflicts on the western frontier. The British, though, expecting American incursions into Canada as conflicts continued across the Atlantic, renewed their relationships with and began arming their native allies. The British partnership coincided with the rise of the Prophet and his brother Tecumseh, whose ascensions convinced Indian nations of their superior virtues and emboldened a political and military alliance bent on halting white expansion, recovering the Northwest, and making the Ohio River a lasting boundary forever between the United States and Indian country. By the spring of 1812, the British-Indian alliance was evident. For the first time since the American Revolution, Indians renewed coordinated raids on white settlements, terrifying settlers, and stymieing American expansion into the remaining British territory. While white frontiersmen in the North demanded the conquest of Canada by the United States, those in the South looked to see Spanish Florida. The desire for Florida became another motivation for war with Great Britain. Spain was Britain's ally, and a war with England might provide an excuse for taking Spanish, as well as northern British territories. By 1812, war fever was raging in both the northern and southern United States. That sentiment found support in Washington among a group of young war hawks in Congress. The War Hawks, including John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, and others. Clay was the Speaker of the House, who pushed President James Madison, remember the predecessor to Jefferson, into authorizing a second war against Great Britain, just a few short decades after the American Revolution. The nationalist fervor for more land also encouraged support for their American system. The American system, a national effort to bind the republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals in order to make America economically independent and connected. After Napoleon launched a catastrophic campaign against Russia that left the French in disarray, Great Britain was able to turn its attention back to the United States. The American efforts to invade and take Canada were largely unsuccessful. General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee took brutal action against Spanish-backed natives as he pushed his way down the Florida Peninsula. Meanwhile, the British landed near the United States Capitol and set fire to several public buildings, including the White House, on their way toward Baltimore, where American victory would later be immortalized by the Star-Spangled Banner. The words of the song detail the improbability of a second victory against the great British Empire and mark the beginning of a renewed spirit of nationalism in the United States. Most battles, however, did not go well for the Americans in the War of 1812. In New England, opposition to the war and to the Republican government was so extreme that delegates met in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814 to discuss their grievances and to consider leaving the United States or seceding from the young nation. It was only after a series of battles that Andrew Jackson's famous victory at the Battle of New Orleans, immortalized in song, and reports of a weak peace treaty being considered, the Treaty of Ghent, signed, I believe, on Christmas Eve, 1814, that squelched the fervor of the secessionists. In truth, the British were simply deeply in debt, and with the defeat of Napoleon on his war on Russia, Americans knew that the British would no longer have very much incentive to continue to interfere with American commerce on the high seas. For the Indian tribes east of the Mississippi, the War of 1812 was another in a series of doomed efforts to resist white expansion. After the failures of pan-Indian unity and the loss of the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tecumseh's Confederation floundered. Their intertribal alliance against Americans, too, had failed. Their allies, the British, were gone from the American continent for good. And the end of the War of 1812 spurred a new white movement westward that threatened to upend the native history of the continent entirely. James Monroe's election after the conclusion of the War of 1812 signaled the death knell of the Federalists. Some now predicted an era of good feelings and an end to the bitter party divisions that had coincided with Washington's departure. The War of 1812 had cultivated a profound sense of union among a diverse and divided people. The Monroe Doctrine, for instance, declared that the United States now considered the entire hemisphere, that is Canada all the way through South America, was now off limits to new European colonization. Yet this era of good feelings would never really come. Political division continued. Though the Federalists would fade from political relevance, a schism within this Republican Party would give rise to a new faction, the Jacksonian Democrats. At the same time, industrialization and the development of American capitalism presented new changes in the lives of ordinary Americans. Social change and increased immigration prompted nativist reactions that would divide true Americans from dangerous or undeserving others. Still, a cacophony of voices clamored to be heard and struggled to realize a social order compatible with the ideals of equality and individual liberty.